You ever notice how the deepest confusion in love doesn't come from people who don't care, but from people who care differently? One person goes quiet, the other feels everything louder in that silence. And suddenly, love doesn't feel like love anymore. It feels like decoding a language nobody gave you the dictionary for. Because here's what nobody tells you early enough. An avoidant doesn't always walk away because they don't feel. Sometimes they walk away because what they feel is too intense, too fast, too real, and they were never taught how to stay present in it. So they do the only thing they know how to do. They create space. They create silence. Not always to punish you, but to regulate themselves. And on the other side of that silence is the super empath. Someone who doesn't just love you, absorb. You notice shifts in tone, changes in energy, the words not said, the emotions hidden between sentences. You don't just hear people, you feel them. So when silence enters the room, it doesn't feel empty to wet, feels loaded, heavy, personal. And that's where the misunderstanding begins. Because you start asking questions like, what did I do wrong? And they're asking themselves, why does love feel like it's closing in on me? And both of you are reacting from protection, not destruction. But here's the truth that changes everything if you're willing to hear it. Love cannot survive where communication collapses into guessing. You cannot build something divine on emotional confusion. The super empath believes deeply in connection through honesty, through presence, through emotional transparency. But when you meet someone avoidant, your depth can feel like pressure to them. Not because you're wrong, but because they've learned that too much closeness equals loss of control. So what do? They step back. They go quiet. They delay. They disappear into space. And what do? You lean in harder. You try to close the gap. You give more, explain more, feel more, thinking that if they just understood how deeply you care, they would stop withdrawing. But love doesn't grow in emotional chasing, and it doesn't grow in emotional disappearance either. It grows in presence. And this is where the shift has to happen. Because if you are the super empath, your lesson is not to feel less, it is to stop abandoning yourself in order to reach someone who is not meeting you halfway. Your depth is not a mistake, but it must be anchored in self-respect. Love should not require you to decode silence until you lose your own voice. And if you are the avoidant, your lesson is not to become someone you're not. It is to realize that emotional distance may protect you, but it also blocks you from the very thing you crave, real connection without fear. The divine principle here is simple but uncomfortable. What you avoid controls you, and what you overgive to defines you. At the highest level, love is not one person chasing and the other retreating. Love is two people learning emotional responsibility. One learns to stay present, the other learns to stay whole. And when that happens, something powerful shifts. Silence is no longer confusion. Depth is no longer overwhelming. Connection is no longer fear-based, it becomes choice-based. So if you're standing in this dynamic right now, don't just ask, why are they like this? Ask something far more powerful. Am I staying in a dynamic where I have to shrink, chase, or decode in order to feel loved? Because the moment you stop abandoning yourself, you stop attracting relationships that require you to. And that's when love stops being a puzzle and starts becoming peace. Avoidant individuals are often misunderstood as cold, detached, or emotionally unavailable. But that surface-level interpretation misses the deeper emotional truth underneath their behavior. At their core, many avoidant people are not disconnected from feelings, they are overwhelmed by them. Emotional intensity, especially in close relationships, can feel like something that takes over their internal world too quickly, too deeply, and too uncontrollably. So instead of learning how to sit inside that intensity, they learn how to step away from it. Distance becomes their form of emotional regulation. This doesn't happen randomly. It is usually shaped by early experiences where emotional expression may have felt unsafe, inconsistent, or overwhelming. If closeness was paired with pressure, criticism, unpredictability, or emotional demand, the nervous system learns a simple survival strategy: reduce closeness to reduce stress. So later in life, when someone gets emotionally close, the body doesn't interpret it as love first, it interprets it as potential loss of control. And when the body feels unsafe, the mind follows by creating distance, silence, or emotional withdrawal. But here is where the misunderstanding deepens in relationships. The avoidant person often does feel deeply. They can care, they can love, they can be emotionally impacted, but they struggle with sustained emotional proximity. It's not the feeling that scares them, it's the feeling continuing without escape. So instead of processing emotions in real time with another person, they often process alone, in isolation, where they feel more in control of their internal state. Silence is not always absence of feeling, it is sometimes an attempt to manage too much feeling at once. This is why avoidant behavior can feel so confusing to someone who loves openly and deeply. From the outside, it looks like distance equals disinterest, but internally, it can actually be distance equals self-protection. The moment emotional closeness increases, their system may shift into protective mode. They might become quieter, more distracted, less responsive, not because the connection doesn't matter, but because the intensity of the connection has crossed their internal threshold of comfort. What makes this even more complex is that avoidant individuals often value independence highly. They associate emotional self-reliance with strength and safety. So when someone enters their life with strong emotional expression, they are entering a relationship with a strong emotional connection, consistent need for closeness, or high emotional availability. It can unconsciously trigger a fear of losing autonomy. And when autonomy feels threatened, withdrawal becomes the instinctive response. But this withdrawal is not a rejection of love itself. It is a rejection of emotional overwhelm. There is a difference. Love for them can feel real and meaningful, but also activating and destabilizing at the same time. That internal contradiction creates tension they don't always know how to resolve in the presence of another person. So they resolve it by creating space. However, space is not always understood correctly by the person on the receiving end. If you are someone who connects through emotional openness, presence, and verbal reassurance, silence can feel like abandonment. And so a cycle begins where one person pulls away to regulate, and the other reaches closer to feel secure. Neither is trying to harm the relationship. Both are trying to restore internal balance, but in opposite directions. The important truth underneath all of this is that avoidant patterns are not proof of emotional absence. They are often proof of emotional overload without emotional tools. When someone has not learned how to stay grounded in closeness, they will default to distance, not because they don't care, but because it is the only strategy their nervous system trusts. And until that is understood, both people in the dynamic keep misinterpreting each other. One reads silence as rejection, the other experiences closeness as pressure. But beneath both reactions is something very human: the desire to feel safe while being loved. A super empath experiences love in a way that is far beyond surface-level emotion. For them, love is not just something they think about or express, it is something they feel moving through their entire system. They don't simply notice what someone says, they register what someone means beneath the words. Tone, energy shifts, pauses, and even silence become emotionally meaningful signals. This creates a form of emotional sensitivity that is both a gift and a burden, because it allows them to understand people deeply, but also makes them vulnerable to emotional overload. At the core of a super empath is a heightened attunement to emotional truth. They can often sense when something is off long before it is spoken. This ability creates a deep sense of connection with others, because people feel seen without needing to explain themselves fully. But it also creates a tendency to absorb emotional states that do not belong to them. When someone they care about is distant, stressed, confused, or emotionally unavailable, they may be struggling to connect with them. The super empath doesn't just observe it, they feel it internally, as if it is happening within their own emotional world. This is where love becomes intense. For a super empath, connection is not casual, it is immersive. When they bond with someone, they do not love in fragments, they love in wholeness. They think about the person often, they feel the emotional shifts in the relationship deeply, and they are highly responsive to changes in energy. A slight withdrawal from the other person can feel like a significant emotional rupture to them, even if no words have been spoken. This is because their nervous system is wired toward emotional unity, rather than emotional distance. Because of this depth, super empaths often crave emotional honesty more than anything else. Not perfection, not constant attention, but truth. They want to know where they stand, what is being felt, and what is real in the connection. Ambiguity can feel deeply unsettling for them, because their internal world is constantly trying to make sense of emotional signals. When those signals are inconsistent or unclear, their mind and heart begin working overtime to fill in the gaps. And this is where their gift can become painful, because when they love someone who is emotionally inconsistent or distant, they don't just experience confusion, they experience emotional overstimulation. They may replay conversations, analyze silence, or feel responsible for emotional shifts that are not actually theirs to carry. Their depth causes them to search for meaning in places where others might simply move on. Yet despite this intensity, a super empath's love is often incredibly pure in intention. They are not trying to control or overwhelm others. They are trying to connect, to understand, to bridge emotional distance through care and presence. They often believe that if they just love deeply enough, understand deeply enough, or give enough emotional safety, the other person will eventually open up in return. This belief comes from their own way of experiencing love as something that grows stronger through emotional depth and transparency. But not everyone processes love this way. And this is where super empaths can struggle in relationships. Because they assume emotional reciprocity works the same way for everyone, they may find themselves overgiving emotionally, trying harder when distance appears, or becoming more emotionally available when the other person withdraws. Not because they are unaware of boundaries, but because their instinct is to restore emotional connection through deeper presence. At their highest expression, super empaths are capable of extraordinary emotional intelligence. They can create deep intimacy, emotional healing, and profound understanding in relationships where emotional safety is mutual. But when that safety is not returned, they can become drained, confused, or emotionally exhausted without realizing how much they are carrying. Their challenge is not to feel lesser, is to learn that feeling deeply does not require them to absorb everything. Love does not mean taking responsibility for every emotional shift in another person. And connection does not always require constant emotional pursuit. The same depth that allows them to love so powerfully also requires grounding, boundaries, and the understanding that not all silence is theirs to solve. What often gets misunderstood in relationships involving avoidant individuals is the meaning of silence. From the outside, silence looks like absence. It looks like withdrawal, disinterest, or emotional disengagement. But in reality, silence can have very different psychological roots, especially for someone who is avoidantly attached. It is not always a statement about the other person. More often, it is a reflection of what is happening inside their own emotional system when things start to feel too close, too fast, or too emotionally demanding. For many avoidant individuals, intimacy is not a neutral experience. It activates something internally that feels like pressure, expectation, or emotional responsibility. When closeness increases in a relationship, they may begin to feel a subtle but powerful shift in their internal state. Thoughts become heavier, emotions become less organized, and the sense of personal space, psychological and emotional, feels reduced. In that moment, silence becomes a way to restore balance. It is not always about pushing someone away, it is about pulling themselves back into a state where they feel regulated again. This is why their silence often appears after moments of emotional intensity. A deep conversation, an expression of strong feelings, or a moment of vulnerability from their partner can create an internal response that they don't fully know how to manage. Instead of engaging in that heightened emotional space, they may retreat. That retreat is not always calculated. It is often instinctive. Their nervous system is trying to lower emotional stimulation by creating distance. However, to the person on the receiving end, especially someone emotionally attuned, this silence feels very different. It does not feel like regulation, it feels like rejection. The absence of communication is interpreted through the lens of emotional uncertainty. Questions begin to form naturally. Did I say something wrong? Did I become too much? Did I push them away? And in that emotional gap, the mind begins to search for meaning that the silence never actually provided. But the truth is, avoidant silence is often not a message about worth or value. It is a coping mechanism built around emotional overwhelm. When someone has learned over time that closeness can feel consuming or destabilizing, stepping back becomes a way to regain control over their internal world. It gives them space to think, breathe, and re-establish emotional equilibrium without the intensity of relational expectations in front of them. The challenge is that this coping mechanism is relationally disruptive, because while one person is stepping back to feel safe, the other is stepping forward to feel secure. So the gap widens. The avoidant feels pressure when pursued. The partner feels abandonment when distance increases. Neither person is intentionally creating harm, but both are reacting from very real emotional needs that are not being met in the same way. Silence, in this dynamic, becomes a misunderstanding of emotional language. One person is speaking in withdrawal as regulation, while the other is hearing withdrawal as rejection. And because neither translation is being clarified in real time, assumptions begin to replace communication. The relationship then becomes less about what is actually happening, and more about what is being imagined in the absence of clarity. Another important layer is that avoidant silence can also be linked to emotional processing style. Some individuals need distance to understand what they are feeling. Unlike people who process emotions through immediate expression, they may need time alone to organize their internal experience. In silence, they are not always avoiding the relationship itself, they are trying to make sense of their own emotional response to it. But without communication, that internal process remains invisible to the other person. This is where the emotional disconnect becomes most painful. Because silence does not explain itself. It does not reassure. It does not clarify intention. It simply exists. And in relationships where emotional safety depends on responsiveness, that lack of explanation creates instability. Ultimately, avoidant silence is rarely as simple as not caring. It is more accurately a signal of internal overwhelm, emotional self-protection, and difficulty staying present in heightened relational intensity. But without awareness on both sides, it becomes something else entirely in the relationship experience. A space where meaning is created through fear, instead of understanding, and where absence speaks louder than intention. A super empath does not just notice emotions, they resonate with them. Their internal world is highly responsive to the emotional environment around them, especially in close relationships. This means that when they connect with someone, they don't experience that connection as something separate from themselves. It becomes integrated into their emotional field. So when the other person is present, open, and engaged, the super empath feels grounded and alive. But when that same person becomes distant, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable, it doesn't simply register as they are busy or they need space. It registers as an emotional shift that can feel unsettling, confusing, and even physically uncomfortable. This is where emotional overload begins. Not because the super empath is weak, but because their emotional sensitivity has no natural filter for separation. They feel what is happening, but they also feel what they believe is happening beneath what is visible. So silence from another person is never just silence. It becomes a space filled with interpretation, intuition, memory, fear, hope, and emotional projection all at once. The mind tries to make sense of it, but the body is already reacting to it. When someone they care about pulls away, even slightly, the super empath often experiences a surge of internal activity. Thoughts become repetitive. Emotional energy becomes heightened. They may replay recent interactions, searching for signs they missed or moments they could have misinterpreted. This is not obsessive behavior in a simple sense. It is an attempt to restore emotional clarity in a situation that feels unclear. Because for a super empath, emotional uncertainty is not neutral, it is intense. The problem is that when emotional intensity is not resolved externally through communication, it gets processed internally. And in that internal space, emotions can amplify. A small silence becomes a large question. A delayed response becomes a narrative. A shift in tone becomes a possible emotional threat. This is how emotional overload builds, not from one big event, but from continuous micro-uncertainties that accumulate in the absence of clarity. In relationships with avoidant individuals, this dynamic becomes even more pronounced, because the avoidant tendency is to step back when overwhelmed, while the super empath tendency is to move closer when uncertain. So when distance appears, the super empath does not naturally detach and wait. They engage internally. They think, feel, analyze, and emotionally invest more energy into understanding the distance. This creates a one-sided emotional amplification, where one person is reducing stimulation, while the other is increasing emotional engagement. Over time, this can lead the super empath to feel emotionally exhausted without fully realizing why. They may feel tired after interactions that did not seem objectively intense. They may feel anxious after periods of silence that others would consider normal. They may feel emotionally responsible for maintaining connection, even when they are not the ones withdrawing. This is because their internal system is constantly scanning for emotional safety in the relationship. Another layer of this experience is empathy without boundaries. Super empaths often intuitively absorb the emotional states of others, sometimes even mistaking those emotions for their own. So if the avoidant partner is stressed, distant, or emotionally shut down, then the relationship is not working out. The super empath may begin to feel that emotional state internally without understanding that it originated elsewhere. This creates emotional confusion where they cannot easily distinguish between what I feel and what I am. Picking up from them, This blending of emotional experience makes relationships deeply meaningful for super empaths, but also deeply draining if not balanced. They often try to restore harmony by giving more, understanding more, or emotionally adjusting themselves to re-establish connection. But this can unintentionally lead to self-abandonment, where their own emotional needs become secondary to stabilizing the relationship. At a deeper level, emotional overload for a super empath is not just about intensity, it is about lack of emotional resolution. Their system seeks completion through understanding, communication, and emotional reciprocity. When that does not happen, the emotional energy stays active inside them, instead of completing a cycle and settling. This is why unresolved dynamics feel heavy. The emotion does not leave, it lingers, circulates, and continues to seek meaning. The transformative understanding here is that the super empath's depth is not the problem. Their emotional capacity is not the issue. The challenge lies in where that emotional energy is directed and whether it is met with clarity, reciprocity, and grounding. Without those, their greatest strength, deep emotional perception, can become an internal burden that feels like too much, even when the love itself is real and meaningful. What makes the dynamic between an avoidant and a super empath so emotionally intense is not that one person loves and the other doesn't, it's that both are reacting to love through completely different nervous system strategies. One moves toward closeness when they feel uncertainty, and the other moves away from closeness when they feel uncertainty. So when something emotionally significant happens between them, instead of meeting in the middle, they often start moving in opposite directions at the exact same time. This creates the push and pull cycle that can feel almost magnetic at first. The super empath feels a strong emotional pull toward understanding, connection, and resolution. When something feels unclear, their instinct is to lean in, to reach out, to restore emotional closeness through communication or presence. Their internal system equates connection with safety, so distance feels like something that must be repaired. The more uncertain things become, the more emotionally engaged they become. On the other side, the avoidant individual experiences emotional intensity differently. When closeness increases or when emotional expectations begin to feel heavy, their system starts to register pressure rather than comfort. Even if they care deeply, the intensity can feel overwhelming or consuming. So their instinct is not to move closer into that intensity, but to step back from it in order to regain emotional stability. Distance becomes their way of reducing internal overload. The problem is that both strategies are self-protective, but they clash in timing. When the super empath moves closer, the avoidant feels the need to step back. When the avoidant steps back, the super empath feels the need to move closer. Neither is trying to create pain in the other person. Both are trying to regulate their own emotional experience. But the result is a relational rhythm that feels unstable, unpredictable, and emotionally charged. In the middle of this cycle, meaning starts to get distorted. The super empath may interpret withdrawal as rejection, emotional disinterest, or loss of love. The avoidant may interpret emotional pursuit as pressure, expectation, or loss of autonomy. So instead of seeing each other's behavior as regulation, they begin to see it as personal impact. This is where emotional misunderstanding becomes the core of the relationship dynamic. What makes this cycle even more powerful is that it often contains moments of deep connection in between the distance. When the avoidant feels safe, they may open up, become present, and offer emotional closeness. And when that happens, the super empath feels seen, connected, and reassured. These moments reinforce hope. They create emotional memory that says, this connection is real. This depth exists. This is worth investing in. But then, when emotional intensity rises again, the avoidant may withdraw once more to regain balance. And the super empath, feeling that shift, leans in again to restore connection. So the cycle continues. Not because either person is inconsistent in intention, but because both are consistent in their internal coping mechanisms. Over time, this creates emotional fatigue on both sides. The super empath may begin to feel like they are constantly chasing clarity that disappears. The avoidant may begin to feel like they are constantly managing emotional expectations that feel too intense. One feels they are giving more emotionally. The other feels they are being pulled beyond their capacity. Both feel misunderstood. What often goes unseen is that this dynamic is not about lack of love. It is about lack of emotional alignment. Love exists, but the ability to hold love in the same way at the same time does not. One person experiences love through closeness and expression. The other experiences safety through space and regulation. So the same relationship moment can feel like intimacy to one and pressure to the other. The push and pull cycle continues until one of two things happens. Either both people develop awareness of their patterns and learn to communicate their emotional needs without triggering each other's defense systems, or the cycle becomes emotionally exhausting enough that distance becomes permanent. At its deepest level, this dynamic is not about winning or losing connection. It is about two nervous systems trying to protect themselves while still wanting closeness. But without understanding this, each person can mistakenly believe the other is the problem, when in reality, it is the pattern between them that is unresolved. What ultimately transforms the dynamic between an avoidant and a super empath is not more emotion, more effort, or more intensity. It is emotional responsibility. And this is where most people get it wrong. They believe that if love feels difficult, it just needs to be felt more deeply or expressed more strongly. But in reality, what heals emotional misalignment is not intensity, it is clarity. It is the willingness from both sides to take ownership of how they show up emotionally instead of reacting purely from instinct or fear. For the avoidant individual, emotional responsibility begins with understanding that silence is not neutral in a relationship. Even if silence is used as a form of self-regulation, it still impacts the other person. It creates uncertainty, emotional interpretation, and sometimes distress. So emotional responsibility for them means learning to communicate presence even when they need space. It is not about forcing themselves to stay engaged when overwhelmed, but about not disappearing emotionally without context. A simple acknowledgement like "I need time, but I'm not gone" can completely change the emotional experience for the other person. For the super empath, emotional responsibility looks different. It is not about suppressing their depth or becoming less sensitive. It is about learning that not every emotional signal they feel is theirs to carry or fix. Their natural instinct is to restore connection by giving more, explaining more, or emotionally investing further when they sense distance. But emotional responsibility means recognizing when that instinct becomes self-abandonment. It means asking, am I responding to connection or am I trying to rescue it? When both people begin to take responsibility for their emotional patterns, something powerful happens. The relationship stops being driven by reaction and starts being shaped by awareness. Instead of silence triggering pursuit and pursuit triggering withdrawal, there is space for communication before the cycle escalates. Emotional needs are expressed earlier, not after they have turned into tension. At a deeper level, emotional responsibility also means understanding timing. The avoidant learns that stepping away is valid, but leaving emotional ambiguity behind creates confusion. The super empath learns that emotional clarity is important, but demanding it in moments of withdrawal can intensify distance. So both learn to respect timing, not just their own emotional timing, but the timing of the other person's nervous system. This is where communication becomes sacred in the relationship. Not constant communication, not forced communication, but intentional communication. Words that are chosen with awareness of impact. Silence that is not used as avoidance, but as regulated space with acknowledgement. Emotional expression that is not used to overwhelm, and emotional withdrawal that is not used to escape. What makes this shift transformative is that it removes fantasy from the relationship. In unhealthy cycles, both people start interpreting behavior instead of understanding intention. The super empath may begin to imagine meaning in silence. The avoidant may begin to assume pressure in emotional expression. But when emotional responsibility is present, interpretation is replaced with clarification. Instead of guessing, they begin to ask. Instead of assuming, they begin to state. This also creates emotional safety, which is the foundation both people actually want. The avoidant wants to feel that closeness will not erase their autonomy. The super empath wants to feel that emotional connection will not disappear without explanation. Emotional responsibility addresses both needs directly. It creates a structure where closeness does not feel like pressure and distance does not feel like abandonment. However, this level of awareness requires maturity from both sides. It requires the avoidant to tolerate some emotional discomfort in order to stay present in communication. And it requires the super empath to tolerate some emotional uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. Both are being asked to expand their emotional capacity, not by becoming someone else, but by becoming more conscious of their default reactions. At its core, emotional responsibility is about breaking unconscious patterns. It is the shift from "this is just how I react to this," is how my reaction affects the relationship. And that awareness is what turns emotional chaos into emotional structure. Not perfect structure, not controlled structure, but stable enough structure for real connection to exist without constant fear. When this happens, love stops being a cycle of misunderstanding and starts becoming a shared space where both people are allowed to be different, without constantly feeling like those differences are pulling them apart. At the deepest level of emotional relationships, transformation does not come from changing who you are, it comes from changing how you relate to what you feel and what you tolerate. In the dynamic between a super empath and an avoidant individual, this becomes especially important, because both people often enter the connection trying to resolve something internally through the other person. One tries to resolve emotional emptiness through closeness, and the other tries to resolve emotional overwhelm through distance. But real transformation begins when both stop using the relationship as a place to fix internal wounds and start using it as a space to express themselves without abandoning their own emotional truth. For the super empath, the most important shift is learning that depth without boundaries becomes emotional depletion. Their natural instinct is to give, to understand, to stay emotionally available even when the connection is not reciprocated in a balanced way. But self-worth cannot be built on emotional overextension. If love requires constant emotional translation, constant reassurance seeking, or constant self-adjustment to maintain connection, then it slowly becomes self-erasure instead of self-expression. The transformation happens when they begin to realize that their emotional sensitivity is not something that needs to be proven through endurance. It is something that needs to be protected through discernment. This means learning to pause before reacting to emotional silence. Instead of immediately filling the gap with more effort, more explanation, or more emotional investment, they begin to ask a different question. Is this connection meeting me with the same emotional presence that I am offering? That question is not about judgment, it is about alignment, because depth is not meant to be one-sided. It is meant to be shared. For the avoidant individual, transformation does not mean becoming emotionally intense or overly expressive. It means learning that emotional withdrawal, while protective, can also become isolating if it is not communicated. Their growth lies in developing the ability to stay present even when emotional intensity rises, not by forcing themselves into constant closeness, but by not disappearing from relational clarity. They begin to understand that space is healthy only when it does not create confusion for the other person. This requires a shift from automatic retreat to intentional communication. Instead of disappearing when overwhelmed, they learn to express, "I need space to process, but I am still connected." That single act of clarity changes the emotional experience entirely for the super empath. It replaces uncertainty with structure. It replaces fear with understanding. And it allows distance to exist without emotional distortion. At a relational level, transformation happens when both individuals stop interpreting each other's protective mechanisms as emotional truths. The super empath learns that silence does not automatically mean loss of love. The avoidant learns that emotional expression does not automatically mean pressure or control. This reframing is powerful because it breaks the cycle of assumption that fuels emotional escalation. What begins to emerge instead is emotional awareness. The super empath starts to recognize when their emotional intensity is driven by anxiety rather than connection. The avoidant starts to recognize when their withdrawal is driven by fear rather than necessity. And in that awareness, choice begins to replace reaction. This is where love shifts from being instinctual to being conscious. It is no longer just about what you feel in the moment, it becomes about how you choose to respond to what you feel. The super empath learns that not every emotional signal requires immediate action. The avoidant learns that not every moment of closeness requires escape. Both learn that emotional stability is created through response, not reaction. At its highest expression, this transformation leads to emotional sovereignty. The super empath no longer loses themselves in the emotional state of another person. They remain grounded in their own emotional center, while still being deeply open. The avoidant no longer equates closeness with loss of control. They begin to see intimacy as something that can exist alongside personal space without threat. And when both people operate from this level of awareness, the relationship stops being defined by fear cycles. It stops being a space where one person chases and the other retreats. Instead, it becomes a space where both can remain connected without losing themselves, and separate without losing connection. This is the real shift. Not perfect harmony, not constant emotional alignment, but the ability to stay connected without self-abandonment, and stay separate without emotional disappearance. And from that place, love is no longer something that drains or confuses, it becomes something that stabilizes, expands, and deepens both individuals without asking them to become anything other than emotionally responsible versions of themselves. Thank you for your time and openness. May clarity and emotional strength guide your relationships forward. Goodbye, and take care of your peace, your boundaries, and your depth as you move ahead.